Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Berkeley Institute Summer Salon Series Session 3. I'm Ron Hassner, co-director of the Berkeley Israel Institute, and I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Rami Zeedan, who was a former Israel Institute visiting faculty at our institute and is now assistant professor of Israel Studies with the Jewish Studies program at the University of Kansas.
Hello, Ron, and thank you for having me. I'm happy to be once again with UC Berkeley and the Berkeley Institute. I would have preferred to be with you in Berkeley, but given the circumstances, this is the best that we have, and I'm happy to do this with the Berkeley audience. What Israel has is right now is 13 basic laws and some formal and informal arrangements. Top to them is the Israeli Declaration of Independence, in Hebrew, Megillat Atzmaut. So the question is, why now this basic law was proposed and approved in 2018? The discourse that led to the approval of this basic law went by saying that in the 90s, mainly under the Rabin government, from 1992 to 1995, the Knesset approved two key basic laws. One is human dignity and liberty, 1992, and the other one is freedom of occupation, 1994. The Supreme Court in Israel, this is how the right-wing political wing in Israel argues, the Supreme Court used those two basic laws to conduct some kind of a revolution in the legal framework in Israel, and the judicial review was elaborated at the time, and it focused mainly on the democratic character of the state of Israel over its democratic one. So the Israeli Declaration of Independence and other laws passed throughout Israel's history led to a position where Israel self-defined itself as both democratic and Jewish. But then the right wing in Israel has been arguing in the past 2 decades or so that the Supreme Court in Israel is leading the state to more focus on its democratic character over its Jewish one. So they wanted to correct the system by saying, we want to have a basic law that says that the Jewish character of the state, the Jewishness of the state, is something that should be set in stone in the level of a basic law that is the equivalent of a chapter in the forthcoming constitution that never has happened yet. But this is what led them to argue that they need such a legal framework at the level of a basic law. Hence, they have been proposing this law since 2011 and even earlier than that. But in 2018, they successfully approved Basic Law number 13, which is Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people.
Excellent. Thank you. Very, very helpful. So you've published a very careful scholarly criticism of this law from the Druze perspective. I'm going to advertise this journal here called Israel Studies, in which your essay appears together with other criticisms of the law, as well as analyses that are more supportive of it. In part, I'm advertising this because Professor Zeedan and I are both on the board of this journal, and we take great pride in it. So please share this criticism with us. And in particular, could you tell us how the criticism of this law from a Druze perspective is different from the criticism of this law from an Arab perspective?
Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen in order to show few things, and I will shut this sharing of screen when I end talking about this. So I'm just going to switch now. I hope this will be successful. So this is, everybody is seeing that? Just to be—
Looks great.
Okay, so this is just the title with my details, but I'm going to skip now over here. So criticism of the law can come from different perspectives. Is this basic law constitutional? Is it in line with international law? Does it contradict what has been seen in other countries, and so forth? So I'm not a legal scholar. I cannot argue in favor or against these kind of things. But what I'm going to do is offer my criticism against this basic law from the point of view of the Arab citizens of the State of Israel. So we see here on my shared screen a few figures that are relevant to have some background about the Arabs living in Israel. And once again, I don't know how much my audience know and how much they don't know. So I'm going to start with the basic figures of data. What I'm going to propose over here is the criticism against the law from the point of view of the Arab citizens of the State of Israel. So I'm not going to talk about the Palestinians living in the West Bank or the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. What I'm talking about is the Arabs living inside Israel, in the Galilee, in Mount Carmel, nearby to the center of Israel, Tel Aviv and Jaffa, and in the Negev and so forth. So we're talking about 1.8 million Arabs who are citizens of the State of Israel, and they make up 21% of Israel's population. The makeup of those Arabs in Israel is, as shown here on the slide that I have prepared. So 80% of the Arabs in Israel are Muslims, specifically Sunni Muslims, and 10% are Christian Arabs. And then we're going to focus later on the Druze that make up 8% of the Arab population, which is about 2.5% of the entire Israeli population. So the question that I was addressed is, what is the criticism and what was the difference between the Arab general perspective and that of the Druze that differs from the other Arabs in Israel? So I'm going to explain that difference, but I'm going also to show you a few pictures that can help me explain it the best. So we see here 4 pictures taken from protests that happened in August 2018 after the basic law was approved. But these 4 pictures tell different stories, different narratives. On the right side, we see that these 2 pictures were taken from a Druze-led protest. And I must here disclose that I myself participated in this protest. So this Druze-led protest, what we see here in the pictures is that we see the Israeli flag shown here, also here. We also see the Druze flag, which is a religious symbol. It's not a national symbol. We see here also the use of language that is mainly focusing on Hebrew. We see the use of the IDF uniform, and by the way, this is one of my best friends in my hometown back in Dalat el-Carmel. The use of the IDF uniform in order to argue that we did our duty. Now we argue in favor of our basic rights, individual and group rights, to be granted to us. If we look at the text, for those of you who can read Hebrew, it's talking about second-class citizens, saying that the Druze are second citizens and all of the other Jewish Israelis are not. So this is what, in general, what emerged from the protest just by looking at these pictures. On the left side, we see the Arab-led protest. 1 week later, we see the Palestinian national flag with the Israeli flag, but this was not present in the Druze-led protest. Looking at the language, we see Arabic, Hebrew, and some English. If we look at the words that are being used over here, so we're talking about words such as fascist, apartheid, resist, and Gaza. So I think that these are self-evident to help me explain what is really the difference between these two narratives of the Druze and of the other Arab Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel. So the question now is, what was the criticism by those Arab Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel? So their criticism against the Basic Law can be put in four main points. The first one is that they protested that the Basic Law designates the state to be a Jewish state. They argued against the symbols of the state, all of which come from Jewish history and religion. This is the first point. Second point is that the Basic Law disregarded the Arab citizens as individuals and as a group. So they're talking about disregarding their individual rights and their group rights and downgrading the status of the Arabic language. So this is the second point. The third point was that it discriminates against Arabs, specifically in relation to lands and housing, and how this could affect equality in the State of Israel to all Israeli citizens. The fourth point that was important to the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel is that it had some future implications on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, meaning that it could be implemented in the future in case of annexation of the West Bank. It could be also implemented over there. So this is the case of the Arab citizens of the State of Israel against the Basic Law that we are discussing. In contrast to that, the Druze were much more modest in their demands, but they were much more vocal in their outcry. So first, the Druze disagreed with the Arab perspective in two of the points, or two out of the 4 points that I just mentioned. The Druze did reconfirm that they have no problem with the Jewish character of the state, with the Jewishness of the state, with its symbols. And this sharply contradicts the Arab perspective. The second point that the Druze contradicted is that they did not deal with the future implication of this Basic Law on future annexation of the West Bank. So they did not mention anything that is related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The two other points, the Druze did agree from the 4 points that I mentioned earlier. So they did argue that the Basic Law disregarded any non-Jewish citizen of the State of Israel, that it did hurt their individual and their collective rights, and that did downgrade the Arabic language. They also agreed that the article that deals with lands and housing is discriminatory against them, and it could hurt the status of equality in the State of Israel. So to conclude this question, the Druze basically argue that they accept the Jewishness of the state, but they ask for a compensation for their compromise. They say, okay, we understand that this is the situation, but at least guarantee us that we are going to live in a democratic country with equal rights, both individual and collective rights.
Excellent, thank you. Rami, do you want to unshare your slides?
Yes.
So there's a pile of scholars out there that have argued that this law is really not very controversial at all. For example, Eugene Kontorovich, who teaches law at George Mason University, demonstrated that many European democracies affirm the identity of the majority population of the nation in ways that are quite similar. They include Spain, Greece, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Latvia, Slovakia, and almost all of Israel's neighbors, including the Palestinians and the Palestinian Constitution. How would you respond to that claim?
Okay, thank you for this question. I'm going to share once again my screen and allow for those of you who have not read the text of the basic law, if you can hear me and also try to read that. So let's try to do it once again. I'm going to skip to the next slide. And there are two slides over here. Here we see this translation of the basic law, Articles 1, 2, 3, and the next slide are Articles 4 to 7. And I'm going to start answering the question by saying that the main problem here is the definition of the state as being Jewish. But the problem here is, what does it mean being Jewish? Do the Jews themselves agree for a one meaning for what does it mean being Jewish? So I want to take this discourse into the beginning of Zionism. One of the things that Zionism brought to the discourse is by saying that being Jewish is not a matter of religious affiliation only. It's a matter of a national affiliation. Therefore, the Zionist movement argued that there needs to be an independent state for the Jewish people. Hence, we have the state of Israel since 1948. So now I do accept this argument. It makes sense. I don't want to argue against that. I have no problem with this kind of definition. The problem is that since the very first moment of the establishment of the state of Israel, it did have a considerable population of non-Jewish minority, or once again, minorities. And this contradicts the very basic definition with the state of Israel being defined as being Jewish. So the question is, what would the state do and how it would define itself by saying that the state is being Jewish and at the same time being Jewish and democratic. So there is a basic contradiction over here, and the problem with this language of the text that you can see here and read is it intentionally disregard this balance of defining the state as at the same time being Jewish, which once again, the Druze argue that they have no problem with that. But the problem is, what is missing in this document is that it's intentionally disregards this balance of defining the state as being both Jewish and being democratic. I'm going to skip to the next part of the translation of the basic law and then try to go back to the question that I was asked. So we see here Articles 4 to 8. I think there was also Articles 9 and 10 in the next slide, but they are less important for my discussion. So I was asked about comparison of this text to other constitutions of the countries that were mentioned. And I would argue that this comparison is not that relevant. All countries that were mentioned do have a formal, written, and complete constitution. This is not the case in Israel. And then the question is, how do we compare one text that should, in the eyes of those who approved it and drafted it in the first place, wanted to see it as a complete document that would serve a purpose of saying that we are defining the state as being Jewish, meaning that we want that to maybe overcome the democratic character of the state, and then we want to compare that to the other constitutions. I did read, not in full details, all of those constitutions that were mentioned. In none of those examples, the Constitution favors one religion over the other. So it does include a definition of the state religion in other countries, but then it stops over there. It does not go to, for example, let's read Article number 6. the state will strive to ensure the safety of the members of the Jewish people in trouble or in captivity due to the fact of their Jewishness or their citizenship. So this is, once again, I have nothing to say against this. The state can strive to ensure the safety and members of the Jewish people, and this is a good goal for the state of Israel. However, I would ask in the eyes of the Arab citizens of the state of Israel. So if an Arab, let's see how an Arab citizen would treat that. If I am an Arab citizen and I am in danger, in trouble, in captivity, when I read this document, I don't see here that the state would strive to ensure my safety as a citizen of the state. It would only strive to ensure the safety of the Jewish citizens of the state of Israel and the Jewish people in the diaspora. So I'm left out of this protection by the state. Looking at article number 7, it would be the same. The state views the development of Jewish settlements as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation. Once again, a very nice text that serves the purpose in the first place of the establishment of the state of Israel back in 1948. But let's now look at it from the point of view of an Arab citizen who has no problem with the state of Israel, has no problem with it defining itself as Jewish, but then the implication of defining it as Jewish is saying that the state would ensure the development of only Jewish settlements, housing and lands and so forth, but not that of the Arab citizen of the state of Israel. So once again, what I would like to argue here is that the comparison to other countries is not relevant because Israel does not have a one complete written constitution. So we are here basically comparing two things that are not the same. One another thing is that none of those countries do have a considerable percentage of the population that is minorities, such as the case in Israel, which is 21% of the population are Arabs, not Jewish, and it's an indigenous minority, not migrant one. And I don't want to get into the discussion of should immigrant people also get their rights or yes or not, but because for the case of Israel, we are not talking about Arabs who migrated to become citizens of the state of Israel. They were there in 1948. And the third argument against this comparison is none of those constitutions that were mentioned delve into details after defining the religion of the state of favoring one religion or the members of one religion over the members of the other religions.
Great, thank you. I disagree with some of what you said, but I'd like to move on to the next question. But that was very, very helpful. So if I understand your criticism correctly, the problem is not so much what is in the law, but rather what is missing from the law. A protection of democratic individual and civil rights. Defenders of this basic law claim that the purpose of the law is purely symbolic and declarative. They argue that it includes no legally enforceable statements that have sort of tachlis implications, that it reflects communal aspirations but has no concrete effect on individual or civil rights, because those civil rights are secured in other laws, older laws, and this new law does nothing to undermine those older laws. How would you respond to that criticism?
Okay, so I do not agree with that. Two major points. One, there are articles in this basic law that can be implemented, can be used in practice. For example, the one that is relevant to the language. Before this text, this new language, many scholars have argued that the legal framework in Israel puts Arabic and Hebrew as both official languages. And now the new basic law says that Hebrew is the official language and there is a special status for the Arabic language. The implication of that on the ground, it could be that in some places they would not continue using the Arabic language. For example, in traffic signs in Israel. If you visit Israel, you would see traffic signs in Hebrew, in Arabic, and in English. In the future, it could be that they would use only Hebrew and English. They would argue Hebrew is the official language of the State of Israel. We are not obliged to use the Arabic language. So there is a possible implication of that. There was an argument in Beersheba. There's a growing percentage of the population who are Arabs, mainly Bedouins, that are moving, for example, to Beersheba. And then the buses who announced the stops were using Hebrew announcement and also Arabic announcement. Some of the Jewish residents in Beersheba complained to the municipality of Beersheba that they don't want to hear the Arabic language being announced in their buses. So the Beersheba municipality could argue that we are using the basic law, or the article that deals with the language, that Hebrew is the official language of the State of Israel, and therefore we could just use Hebrew announcement in the buses, regardless of what was previously done, and regardless of the situation that a considerable percentage of the population that are using these buses are Arabs and need to hear that announcement in Arabic. So this is one example of how this could be implemented. The other one that is much more problematic is Article number 7 that deals with Jewish settlements. So previous to the law, Israel, over its history, did confiscate hundreds of thousands of dunams that owned privately by Arab citizens of the State of Israel. In some of these cases, those Arab residents appealed to the Supreme Court. If they had a good lawyer, if they had a good argument, if they had luck by having specific justice sitting on the bench at the time, they maybe got the help of the Supreme Court of being defended or having their lands back to them, having a higher amount of compensation, monetary compensation for the land that was taken from them. So there was a chance that maybe you would get justice. Now, after we have Article number 7, let's say 1 year from now, the State of Israel decides to establish new Jewish settlements in the Galilee. For that purpose, they need to confiscate lands. Some of those lands are owned privately by Arabs. The government can argue, using Article 7 on the Basic Law, that we are exactly fulfilling the intention of the Basic Law, which is establishing Jewish settlements. An appeal to the Supreme Court in the future made by those Arabs would not be as much as successful, because the government would say, Supreme Court cannot rescind this confiscation because we are implementing the intention of the law. So the first argument against what you just asked me is that some articles in this basic law can be implemented, can be used. Having said all of that, I am not a legal scholar. I am a scholar dealing with history, with politics, with society. So my argument against this basic law is not what could be implemented out of it. My argument is what it did to the relations between Arabs and Jews in Israel, and more specifically to the relations between Druze and Jews in Israel. So what this basic law did is it did hurt the basic feeling of identity of the Druze people. The Druze people have been living since the 50s, to be much more precise, not specifically 1948, much later on, 1 decade later, have been living in a sense of identity that would say that they are Arabs by culture, they are Jews by religion, but they are Israelis by their national affiliation. They would argue with their fellow Arab citizens of the State of Israel, they would argue with Muslims and Christian Arab, you should do the same as we do. Give the state a chance. Don't support the Palestinian cause. join the Israeli army, do your civic duty by doing what the state is asking you to do. In exchange, you would get the sense of belonging, being part of the Israeli nation, getting your individual rights and getting your group rights. So even though equality did not happen in Israel in 100% previous to the law, at least there was the vision for the future, for a better situation between Jewish citizens and non-Jewish citizens in the state of Israel. A vision for a better Israel in the future, a more democratic one. Now what the basic law did was as if it was speaking to those who had a vision by telling them, we are going to define the nation of the state as a one that is only Jewish. If you are Jewish, you are part of the nation. If you are not Jewish, you can never become part of the nation, regardless of what you do. So what this basic law did is collapsed the Druze narrative in the state of Israel, which was in the first place created with the help of the Zionist movement, with the help of the Jewish Israelis themselves.
Excellent. That's very clear and very helpful. Thank you. Rami, let me finish our conversation by asking what may be the most important question of all. What do you think the next steps should be? How do you think that the rift which you described might be healed in the months and years to come?
Okay, first of all, I think that unfortunately, given the political situation right now in Israel, I do not see that there is a real option of changing the situation with this basic law, at least in the foreseeable future. The problem is that the right wing that drafted and supported and voted for this basic law do not think that there is a problem. The center and some of the center left also think that the basic law is generally accepted, needs a little bit of a change towards a more democratic situation, but not thinking that it should be rescinded or replaced with something else. So one another problem is that there is a huge Jewish Israeli support for this basic law. In the surveys that has been conducted since it was approved, the majority of the Jewish Israelis support the language of the basic law. So I don't think that there is a possibility for a change in this position. And this is really a problem for the future of the state of Israel. And we want to see, at least I want to see, a better future for the state of Israel, where all parts of society are feeling that they are integrated, that they can work together, that they can achieve a more successful state of Israel in the future. And how we do that is by changing this situation to what I really suggest is doing this in two steps. In the first step, replacing the nation state basic law with another document that already exists, which is the Declaration of the Independence of the State of Israel, Megillat Ha'atzmaut. In that document, which is a very well-written document, it guarantees the Jewish character of the state. So it answers the demands and the fears of the Jewish Israelis that they might lose their own country. So this document guarantees that it's going to be a Jewish state. But in the same text, in the same language of the text, you would find that this document guarantees full equality to all non-Jewish citizens of the state of Israel. It guarantees individual and group rights to the Arab citizens of the state of Israel. It also guarantees that there would be representation in the political system. So if we take this document, it answers the demands of both the Jewish Israelis and also the Arab Israeli citizens, including the Druze, and it gives that in one whole document. So this should replace the basic law nation state that was approved in 2018. So this is the first step, but this does not really answer the current problems that still exist, such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and other areas that both sides might feel that it is not working well in terms of the relations between Arabs and Jews in the state of Israel. So in order to do that, we need a new social contract for the state of Israel. I would like to see in the future that Arab politicians in Israel with Jewish Israeli politicians from the left and the right wing have a debate of how do we see our future. We are here to stay. The Jewish Israelis are here to stay. The Arab 21% of Israel's population is here to stay. The state of Israel is here to stay. So how we make this work better for the sake of all citizens of the state of Israel, for the sake of the state itself. In order to do that, we need to have all those politicians, all those representatives having such as a discourse between them, deciding what one side wants, what the other side is capable of compromising on, and having a new social deal that would see the benefits for all sides.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for educating us and for sharing both your scholarly point of view and your personal point of view. We are deeply grateful and hope to see much more of you in the very, very near future.